Hey there, I'm Tracy Rigdon, and this is the Contrast Project Lounge podcast. Often random, but always relevant, always real, and practically nothing is off limits. This podcast is for you. Are you ready for this? Let's do it. Welcome back to the podcast, friends. I'm so glad that you are here with us today. I want to thank you and you and you. And back with me today is my co-host, my good friend, Mr. Reese Dickerson. Reese, how are you?
I am doing well. Thank you for asking. Listen, it's always a pleasure to be here to serve as co-host beside you, Tracy. Thank you so kindly for having me.
Oh, my goodness. It's always a pleasure to have you. You're a great guy. Hey, we also have, and Reese, you've met this man, and I have not. Our very special guest for the day, author of what, 4 or 5 books, 5 books, civil rights activist, and much more than that. 4 books. Much more than that, Mr. Rodney Lawrence Hurst Sr. Mr. Hurst, it is an honor to have you here on my program.
It's an honor to be here, Tracy, and howdy again, Reese.
Hey, sir. The Honorable Rodney L. Hurst. Yes, sir.
There you go. I was going through. I've been going through my notes for some time. It's unfortunate that we had missed each other before, Rodney. But I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm glad that we got you on the program before the end of February, so that I can get the program posted on YouTube and on the website and everywhere else. At least, probably by tomorrow evening, and at least by Monday. So that we can get this program, this recorded program, out there before the end of February, because it's Black History Month. And I wanted to, again, thank you for being here, and it's an honor. Reese, let me ask you real quick, yes, before we go forward. Rodney was just saying something a little bit ago about you singing the anthem. I see Rodney's face.
No, not the anthem.
Right.
When
your anthem.
In my second book, I did a chapter on James Weldon Johnson. He never considered Lift Every Voice and Sing an Anthem. He always considered it a hymn.
Hymn.
And when he became executive secretary of the NAACP in 1920, for 10 years, the NAACP adopted Lift Every Voice and Sing as the national Negro hymn, but he did not want his song competing as an anthem.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, Black folk embraced Lift Every Voice and Sing because of dealing with racism and fighting bigotry and discrimination. So that became our anthem, if you will. But
right.
James Weldon Johnson never considered it an anthem. But Reese did a beautiful job of singing Lift Every Voice and Sing. And we have a private conversation that I'm not going to share unless he shares it.
Yes, sir.
Of the two of us talking.
Well, I'll tell you, Tracy, you brought that up, and it really affected me for a few days. When you have someone of Mr. Hurst's stature and his accomplishments and who he is to our community and the way he shares our story and our history, when you have him come and say to you and kind of tighten your shoestrings or correct you, it's not an insult. Being in my 50s, it's not an insult. It's having my elders saying, hey, this is what we do and this is how you honor what we do and who we are. What he said to me was, I did the abbreviated version of the song. I did verse 1, verse 3 instead of all 3 stanzas and the choruses as they are. He said, don't you ever not sing all 3 stanzas. He said, that is our song. We need to know it. You're a singer, and it is your responsibility to communicate that and make sure everybody hears everything that song means. And it was right on time. It really helped me a lot. So
I also said you did a beautiful job because I heard
did. Yes, sir, you did. Yes, sir, you did. Yes, sir, you did.
NAACP breakfast, and then also
yes, sir. Yes, sir, you did.
Program. So that was a treat both times.
Thank you so kindly. That's an honor to hear you say that. Thank you kindly. That's an honor.
I wanted to
That is an
ask you,
honor.
Rodney. I know
Yeah.
there's probably many moments, but could you share with us, some of your one or some of your defining moments from your earlier years in the civil rights movement that shaped your commitment to the cause?
When you understand, and in my last book, I wrote, the name of the last book I wrote is Black and Brilliant, and it's for young adults 12 to 18. I walked around as a preteen and as a teenager, not understanding why there were colored and white signs, why there were Negro and white signs, why there were Negro waiting rooms and Negro bathrooms. And when you go to a doctor's office, there was a Negro waiting room. When you went to a governmental office, there was a Negro waiting room. When you went to the bus station, there was a Negro waiting room. When you went to the train station, there was a Negro waiting room. And I would ask my parents, my grandmother, my mother, my preacher, why are these things, why are we separated like this? And the bottom line was, well, that's just the way things are. And it wasn't until I started school when I was 5 and I got skipped. So I'm 2 years chronological age behind the rest of my class. So I went to 8th grade. I'm 11 years old in 8th grade. And those questions were still in my mind. And my 8th grade American history teacher was named Rutledge Pearson. And the Black schools in Duval County were a part of what was called the Negro Division of the Duval County school system. The person in charge of the Negro Division was an earned PhD, Dr. John Irvin Elias Scott. The overall superintendent of the school system, Ish Brandt, was elected, and he just had an undergraduate degree. But Mr. Pearson told us the first day of his American history class to leave that American history book at home. He will not teach us American history from the racist and slanted viewpoints of white textbook authors and historians who only saw fit to include the names of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington in this American history textbook.
Right.
And we proceeded to understand American history, and Mr. Pearson taught us American history outside of this textbook. And he also said to us, freedom is not free. If you're not a part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And he encouraged us to join the Youth Council NAACP. This was 1955. That was my defining moment, starting my journey down the civil rights road and Black history road. 3 years later, I am sitting in a restaurant next to the NAACP office, which was on Broad Street. And in walks Earl Johnson, who was the NAACP attorney. And behind Earl Johnson, Thurgood Marshall. And behind Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley. I knew who Thurgood Marshall was from studying about him in Mr. Pearson's class and the Brown decision of 1954. I did not know Mrs. Motley, who, interestingly, Ketanji Brown Jackson, when she was appointed or confirmed to the Supreme Court, Black female, said that Constance Baker Motley was one of her heroes. Constance Baker Motley wrote the brief, the legal brief, on behalf of the dream team then of these lawyers under Thurgood Marshall that went to the Supreme Court. So when you are in the presence of these giants, and I did,
Yes,
like
sir.
I said, I didn't know very much about Constance Baker Motley. But one of the first things Thurgood Marshall said to us after we were peppering him with questions and he came over and he sat down, he told us the story of the Groveland Four. And the Groveland Four were 4 blacks who were accused of raping a white female. And in the course of being arrested and being hunted down, one person was killed, another one went to jail. Thurgood Marshall got their convictions thrown out of court. Thurgood Marshall went to Groveland, Florida, in Lake County to do some investigatory work. And Willis McCall, who was a very racist sheriff in the annals of the state of Florida, found out he was in Groveland and sent some of his goon squads out to get Thurgood Marshall. A black funeral director, knowing where Thurgood Marshall was staying, back during those days, blacks stayed with black families. They were like black B&Ds because there were no hotels and motels at that time. So this black funeral director, knowing where Thurgood Marshall was staying, went to him, told him what the situation was, and he said, "I've got a plan. I'll come back in 15 minutes." Now, this is Thurgood Marshall telling the story. By the way, there is a Pulitzer Award-winning book called Thurgood Marshall and the Groveland Four. He came back in a hearse, and he said, "Miss Marshall, what I'm going to do, I've got a casket in the back. I'm going to put you in that empty casket in the back of the hearse. And I'm going to drive you over to Ocala, which was the next county over. And I'm going to turn you over to a gentleman who will drive you to Jacksonville so you can catch the train back to New York." And that's what happened. I'm telling this story in Orlando, Florida. I'm speaking at a Presbyterian church. And after it was over with, a Mr. Lambert came up to me and said, elderly black gentleman, he said, "Mr. Hurst, I was smiling while you were telling that story." He said, "You got it right." I said, "I got it right?" He said, "Yes. I was the man who the funeral director brought Mr. Marshall to drive to Jacksonville. And my only instruction from him and two other gentlemen who were with him, don't leave Thurgood Marshall until he gets on the train." And those are, I mean, when you meet heavyweights like that you read about, and again, I'm 11, 12, 13, 14, I become president. I was elected president of Youth Council at age 15 and led the sit-ins at 16. But when you meet these bigger-than-life persons, both black and white, you sit up, and my mother used to tell me when I was awestruck to close your mouth, son. You sit up, your mouth is open,
Yeah.
and you learn how to listen. And the motivation, I can't even describe. We would have mass meetings during the Civil Rights Movement in black churches because those were the largest venues that we could have. So from Harry Belafonte to Daisy Bates to Thurgood Marshall to all of these great persons who were involved in the Civil Rights Movement, they would come and speak to hundreds of persons in a packed church about what was happening in the Civil Rights Movement. Roy Wilkins and Jack Greenberg, just tons of folks. You are impressed because even though you're in the initial annals of fighting racism, these folk have dedicated their lives to doing it. And you draw so much inspiration and motivation just from being around them and listening to them. And that was my childhood. That was my childhood from age 11 when I joined the NAACP until today. I was a student at Edward Waters College. The secretary of the Youth Council and I integrated the downtown lunch counters in 1961, which is another story.
Mm-hmm.
And even as a student at Edward Waters College, the clerk of the draft board had let it be known that I was going to be drafted, even though I was a student and had a deferment. So I joined the Air Force at age 17 in April of 1961. But in all of my books, I write different anecdotes, tell different anecdotes about what has happened to me from my earlier years up until today in dealing with the Civil Rights Movement.
Well, clearly, storytelling is a big part of history, and if fellas like yourself aren't telling those stories, uh, well, they're not getting told. Just
Well,
just as
the
one of the
title,
titles of your books. I mean, if you're not telling the stories and passing them down to generations, uh, they certainly are not being told. Because I can tell you for sure, when Tim Gilmore and I interviewed, and he's got a passage in his book about you and this the Warren folks, and he mentioned the same thing. He was basically doing his research as I've done, and it just angers us as white people. Uh, I would say some of us anyway. We're angry because we honestly didn't hear a lot of these stories, and thank you so much for telling them.
well, and interestingly, the Florida Times Union used to have a section called News for and About the Colored People of Jacksonville.
Mm-hmm.
And this section was at the back of the newspaper, and it was for delivery to Black homes. And on the front of the newspaper, in the masthead, was a Black star. And if you were a paper boy, a paper man, and I threw Times Union papers for about 3 months during the summer between my 10th and 11th grade year. These Black newspapers with the star, with news for and about the colored people of Jacksonville, went to Black homes, home delivery. For white home delivery, this section was taken out of the newspaper. White homes did not get the section that said news for and about the colored people of Jacksonville. So as far as white folk were concerned, Black folk did not exist, nor did they read anything in their newspapers about the Black community, nor did they want to read anything about them. If by mistake a star edition with news for and about the colored people was delivered to a white home, they would raise all kind of hell, and they would not want the Black paper man who threw their papers from a car, delivered their papers from a car. You had to, someone from the Times Union building, when it was in the city on the west side, and then later when it moved to Riverside, they had to come and bring a paper to that white home. They wanted no parts of news for and about the colored people of Jacksonville. But that was Jacksonville.
Mm-hmm.
That was Jackson.
That's a shame. And I was going to say, that's just whitewashing history, whitewashing the news, because and they continue to do it to this day. What with the blocking of books, not when people use that term banning books. If you really get down to it, it is a ban. Whether the governor says that some of those books aren't banned or not, they're taking them off the shelves in schools, and if the teachers feel threatened about some of those books, even the ones that aren't on the list, if it's just under it's being reviewed. A lot of the books that are on those lists are being reviewed, right? Well, the teachers are just taking them off the shelves anyway because they don't want to get fined. They don't want to lose their job. That's crazy.
Right.
It's crazy.
A number of my friends who are school teachers have classroom libraries. In fact, many of them have my books. But all of the books have to be vetted to make sure that there's nothing in the books that make white folk feel guilty and uncomfortable.
Right.
If they've got an unvetted book in their classroom, they could be charged and subjected to a Class 3 felony, which is how the administration and the law was passed. So many of them have basically said, to be on the safe side, we just won't have books in our classroom at all.
Yeah.
So many of the teachers who have lived with books in their classrooms as resource books, not only for themselves, for young people, elementary, middle, and high school, when they're working on Black history projects and essays, that they can refer to some of these books. And that has happened a number of times as I have talked with young people about some of my experiences and going off to college and what that meant and reading about Black history. But those books are not there anymore. I call American history incomplete, dishonest, and racist. And I say to many young people then and now that many of you are fed and spoon-fed bland and tasteless baby food that is represented as being gourmet food. Mm-hmm. And we continue to do that. American history does not tell the truth, and it is romanticized. Why are we still, as of, for instance, celebrating the discoverer of America as Thurgood Marshall when he never set foot in the continental United States? Why are we saying that Paul Revere got on a horse and rode from Lexington to Concord saying to arms, the British or the Redcoats are coming? That did not happen. Betsy Ross did not sew the first flag.
Nope.
And Benjamin Franklin did not put a key on a kite, fly the kite up in the air, have the key on the kite struck by lightning, and therefore Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity. None of that happened. But in all of the books, and because American history is repetitive, and we tell the story over and over from elementary to middle school and high school, all of the young people who have taken American history through the Duval County school system and other school systems too, they know those stories and they know those persons who have been represented for doing those things. Alexander Dumas, who's one of my favorites, Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers, The Man in Iron Mask. No one told me he was Black. No one told me that the father of Russian literature, Alexander Pushkin, was Black. No one told me that the great-great-great-grandmother of Queen Elizabeth, the recently deceased Queen of England, Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg, was Black. No one told me that St. Augustine of Hippo was Black, that Hannibal was Black, or that Ludwig von Beethoven's father and grandfather were Moors, Spanish Africans.
And even closer to home, let me ask you, I was told a story as a young child, Charles Bennett and his mother.
I don't know.
I was told that his mother is Black.
I don't know.
And we know who she is.
I don't know. We were told that Dwight Eisenhower's mother was Black. I mean,
right.
But I have never, that had never been verified. What was verified, interestingly, there was an actress named Carolyn Channing.
Yes.
Who was famous for Hello, Dolly.
Yes.
And supposedly in her autobiography, she said that her mother was Black. The interesting thing on all of that is what happens today when you point out those things, understanding that in this country,
yes,
if you had 1/72nd blood, 1/128th, doesn't make any difference how far back it went. Right. If you had any Black blood in your ancestry, any of your heritage, that made you Black in this country. Some Black colleges and universities that were founded to educate the offspring of mulattoes. To be a mulatto, you had to have a white father and a Black mother. You were required to prove that your father was white to be educated in some of these schools, founded and created solely for the purpose of educating mulattoes. But that was this country. And to not even talk about it as if it never happened,
right?
Is so insidious until it is ridiculous, and it is criminal because it mentally cripples our young people.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
on
My,
both sides. Cripples them on
mm,
both
Yes,
sides. It
on
cripples
both
them,
sides.
cripples
And
white kids.
especially here in the state of
You
Florida.
better believe it.
oh,
With the banning of the books and the removal of the books, it's crippling white children. Here's what we've done here in our country. Let's just talk about the state. What we've done is we've considered the emotional condition of white children and their white parents without ever considering the black kids who suffer the same thing
Right.
and who have
right.
lived this their entire lives.
If I use myself as an example, as a 6 and 7-year-old, as I talk about in my latest book, Black and Brilliant, and didn't get on track mentally and psychologically until I went to my 8th grade American history class and met Mr. Pearson. All this time, I walked around wondering and asking questions that I did not get any answers to. Why were we kept separate? 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, I'm asking
Mm-hmm.
those questions. So what does that do to my psyche? You know, I was raised in the Baptist church. I considered myself a Christian, baptized at age 7, and taught that we were all Christians. So if we're all Christians, why am I being separated? What about me means
Exactly.
that I have to go into a separate waiting room and I have
Mm-hmm.
to eat at a separate place and I couldn't associate with white folk at all? What
Mm-hmm.
was it about me?
Right. Oh, and I can tell you firsthand experience too that my because my stepdaughter is black, she in her early teens I just became a step granddad, by the way. But
Great,
her
congratulations.
yeah, but her when she was a teenager in our house, when she was a teenager, she had a hard time and even told she had tears in her eyes, not every day, but quite frequently. She would just be, bundled up in her bed crying. She didn't know where she belonged, uh, because
Yeah.
her mother, my ex-wife, was Hispanic, and her first husband was a black man, and so she didn't know where she belonged in school. She had white friends that uh, and black friends, but some of the bullies or the mean kids on both sides, she was either not black enough or not white enough, and she struggled through her early teen years with that. She really did.
And many black kids struggle, so-called biracial
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
children.
Yes.
They still struggle with that because when you understand that black folk and white folk every day deal with culture clashes,
Mm-hmm.
from whatever it is, from music to watching movies to education to food, there are culture clashes between black folk and white folk.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and invariably, when we talk about history, when history is taught a particular way about an event, where some teachers have taught that Africans were really responsible for slavery, that when they captured other African tribes, persons, that they would give them to the Europeans for them to enslave them, which is just absolutely ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about what happened during slavery, that, well, and I've heard this on more than one occasion, and including dealing with graduate students, Mr. Hurst, some of the enslaved persons were better off in slavery than they were in their homeland of Africa. The ridiculousness of that is so profound and so expansive that it just shows you how little that black life is respected, aside from the fact that during slavery, every white religious denomination owned slaves. And I would tell the story of what's the college in Georgetown College. Georgetown College was founded by Jesuit priests. Jesuit means son of Jesus. In 1838, these Jesuit priests got into trouble keeping the doors of Georgetown College open. And they sold 273 of their enslaved persons to keep the doors of Georgetown College open. Why did these Catholic priests own slaves?
Exactly.
The Southern Baptists met in 1845 in Augusta, Georgia, to start the Southern Baptist Convention for the sole purpose of supporting slavery. The Episcopal Church, and I used to be an Episcopalian, the Episcopal Church said publicly from their national office back during slavery that slavery is a political issue. It is not a moral issue. And because it is a political issue, and because as the church, we don't get in politics, we will not take a position on slavery. Every Ivy League college had part of their building structure and their infrastructure built by enslaved persons. Every president of every Ivy League college owned slaves. But we don't talk about that.
No. And you mentioned too about them being better off, enslaved than in their homeland. That sentiment is still alive today with, the recent comments, I say recent, within the last year of, Governor Ron DeSantis of the state of Florida, mentioning that they had, during slavery, they got some pretty good skills.
Yeah. And see, one of the misnomers, Africans, when they were brought from Africa to this country, were not savages. Throughout the continent of Africa, you had certain agricultural and growing areas that revolved around rice, that revolved around leafy vegetables, that revolved around tree growth. And persons from those areas were very proficient in how to grow those foodstuffs in those areas. So many times when a slave hunter or a trader slave ship got Africans from Africa as enslaved persons, they would tell who they were selling them to where they came from. So then the enslavers knew that this would be a good person to work on rice, that this would be a good person to work on the leafy vegetables that we can develop as tobacco. Whether they had them or not, many of the Africans were very proficient in knowing how to till the soil. Things that happened in Africa was not done by other folk. Africans still knew how to build and do different things. And when they brought those skills to this country, they used those skills while they were enslaved.
Oh, yeah.
But we don't teach it that way. We teach that they were savages, and everything that they learned, the enslavers taught them how to do it. And therefore, we gave the enslavers, gave them skills that they were able to use going forward in their lives.
They brought skills here.
Yes.
They brought skills here that the enslavers did not have, that they did not have anybody to do. They brought those skills here and taught the enslavers. They learned what they saw.
Yes, they did.
And they took that and they made it their own, much like we see today, still today.
There is a guy that you very seldom hear anything about. His name is Onesis, Onesis. He came from Africa as an enslaved person, but he was inoculated against smallpox. And if you go on the internet and you pull his name up, and I might not be spelling it right, but you can get variations of that, Onesius or SIS. He is given credit for telling enslavers what to do to get rid of smallpox in this country. A good friend of mine used to be the president of University of Maryland at Baltimore County. Freeman Hrabowski, black, came out of Birmingham, the Children's Crusade, and his school, University of Maryland at Baltimore County, specialized in STEM courses. He said, Rodney, when Kizzmekia Corbett, who a lot of people don't even know, when she led the team that discovered the vaccine for COVID, she said, I was the first. She told me, Dr. Hrabowski, you're the first person I'm calling to let you know that we did it. We found the vaccine for COVID. Kizzmekia, Kizzmekia Corbett. But again, that gets lost. Henrietta Lacks was a black person who had cancer, and when they got some of her cancer cells, they found out that the cancer cells did not die after a period of time, and her cancer cells from 40 and 50 years ago are still alive and being used in research today.
Yes.
And finally, her ancestors filed suit against some of these companies that had made billions of dollars off of her cancer cells in 2023.
Yep.
And they didn't tell anybody about what a gold mine and what a miracle this black woman's cells were in helping modern medicine.
There is a Law and Order. There's a Law and Order, the television show Law and Order. There's an episode that now that you mention it, I'm a Law and Order buff, but there's an episode that mentions that case to the T. Of course, not using her name or anything like that, but there was a large corporation that was harvesting cells from a black man who had wound up in a facility for extended care or assisted living or so forth. He was losing his thoughts, his mental capacity, but they were coming in there for years and drawing blood samples and taking skin samples and stuff like that, and the corporation was using them they kept a stockpile of his cells and grew them in the lab, and they were using them for cancer research and actually came up with new drugs that made them billions of dollars over the years, and his family never saw a dime of it.
Well, the question that was raised when they won the suit against Henrietta Lacks, for Henrietta Lacks, against two major companies that were harvesting her cells and making billions of dollars. How many other cases are there like that? I mean, we know about the syphilis experiment in Alabama, where they gave black men, injected them with syphilis to see how they would respond without giving them any antibiotics for dealing with. How many other, when you understand how blacks were treated, because during slavery, enslavers and white religious denominations, leaders of those denominations came up with the ploy that, well, let's call these enslaved persons property. Because if we refer to them as property, we can get around the teachings of Jesus Christ and the teachings in the Bible, because we are not calling them human beings. And they were able, with a nod and a wink wink from white religious America, they could look at these millions of persons, hundreds of thousands, and then ultimately millions of persons with warm blood coursing through their body as something other than a human being. And that is the history of this country. And when we talk about that, then a Ron DeSantis says, well, you can't say that. That makes white folk feel guilty and uncomfortable. But that is the truth, and you don't want the truth taught, which is why you banned the books.
Right. So you're more concerned. You're more concerned with the comfort of white people, the continuation of the lies that we sell as an American fabric, as an American government. You're more concerned about that than telling these kids, and they're just going to have to eat it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Let me just say it that way.
Right, right. And when I talk to different groups, and of course, I'm blessed with having to speak at a lot of different places during this month and during the year. And I tell folk, when I look in the mirror, I am looking back at a black face. I understand who I am. And if I am going to advocate who I am, then I have to tell not only my lived experiences, but what I have researched and the truth of understanding these circumstances. And the bottom line is that does not mean I am anti-white. It
No.
means I am pro-black. And if you think that pro-black means anti-white,
Anti-white,
then
right?
you've got a problem.
That's your problem, not mine.
No problem. It ain't my
Exactly.
problem.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
because you had no problem. You have no problem with the continuation of being pro-white, and that doesn't necessarily mean you are a Nazi or you're a racist. But being pro-white means I won't tell the truth about who you are.
Yeah. And understand my entire life. I am 80 years old on March 2nd of this year.
Bless you.
Wow.
So for all of my entire existence, I have dealt with being undercut, denigrated, insulted, all because of my skin color. And white folk don't know who I am. You have not bothered to say to me, let's sit down and talk. Let's see how close we can get to agreeing to agree or agreeing to disagree. No, we don't do that in this country.
Right.
We allow the cultures to clash. And as long as black folk are not in the majority, then tough, which is what stirs the pot so much when
Right.
people say 2040, 2045, whites will be in the minority. No. We've got to make sure that white women have all the babies they can. No abortions for any of that.
Right.
And
Right.
that does not mean, I mean, that means that in this country, there are circumstances, these conspiracies that we deal with,
Yes.
many of them are just based in racism. And instead of us discussing those things so that one day Tracy and I can understand who we are, and we might not agree to disagree, but at least we're communicating and we're discussing some things. The bottom line is, no, we don't want to discuss them at all because some of the things might make white folk feel uncomfortable. I did not enslave and chain myself. I did not pass Jim Crow laws. I did not pass de jure and de facto segregation. I did not keep black folk out of the mainstream of America. I did not free them from slavery and did not give them any reparations so that they can move from their enslaved status to being, but you want me to ignore and forget all of that.
Right.
Because that is my plight. That is my lot. I should be glad that you brought me from Africa, and I should be even happier when my ancestors were freed, that we did not send all of you niggers back to Africa.
Exactly. 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 And sadder still is that here in 2024, we're still having these kind of conversations.
Yeah, we are.
That to me is absolutely grotesque. And even my liberal friends, I tell my liberal friends, listen, you don't understand. You're still a part of the problem.
Yeah.
Just because I can sit next to you. Go ahead, sir.
No one wants to say that. I say in my last book, when you're born white in this country and the privilege that is assigned to you because you are white, It's just like breathing air. It's something that you do, and it's part of the process. There's a white female. Her name is Jane Elliott, one of my favorites, and
Love
I've
her.
got
Love
she
her.
and I have exchanged books. Jane Elliott likes to speak to white audiences,
Oh, of course.
and on YouTube, there's a 45-second spot where she says, "How many of you white folk, knowing what you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
would like to be treated the way blacks are treated in this country? Raise your
Exactly.
hand." And no one raised their hand. She said, you don't understand. Let me repeat it again. How many of you white folk, understanding what you know about this country, would like to be treated as blacks are treated in this country? Nobody raised their hand. She said, that means that you know
You're right.
how blacks are treated in this country, and you don't want any part of it. She said, my question to you, what are you going to do about it?
Right. Jane Elliott.
That's
I
what I
love
say
her.
to white folk. I cannot change racism. I can only fight racism. You can change racism.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Tim Rice is another one. I absolutely love
And then
everything he.
Tim
Rice.
Tim Wise.
Tim Wise. Sorry, Tim Wise.
Yeah.
Yes,
I
goodness.
met Tim. Yeah, Tim is a great guy. And you know, when you meet some of these superstars, some of these celebrities, one of my good friends who's now deceased, he passed in 2019, and his family invited me to speak at his service. I was the only non-family member that spoke during the service of Dr. James Jim Lowen, who wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. Everything your American history textbook got wrong.
Wow.
And some of the things that he said and some of the conversations that you would hear from me, and he also wrote about sundown towns, and he also wrote lies that American history told you about Christopher Columbus. And he was the first person nationally to call for taking down Confederate monuments and statues. So here's a white male teacher who, when he graduated from college, his first teaching job was at Talladega College. And he wrote a book at Talladega that the state of Mississippi tried to ban. And he sued the state of Mississippi and won. And they could not ban his book. But when you just read a little part of any of his books and you understand here is a white person talking about racism in this country, it is not something that's hidden. It's not something that folk don't know about. And when you try to ban that history and ban books that talk about that history, then all you're doing is trying to whitewash what American history is all about. And when, we revel in talking about what other countries did. There was a city in France, Nantes, Nantes, which is a sister city of Jacksonville. During slavery, it was the wealthiest city in Europe. They had fleets of slave trading ships. And when France outlawed slavery, the city of Nantes ultimately purchased a castle owned by the Duke of Brittany. And they dedicated 1/3 of those rooms to slavery and what they did. And when I met them, I had an exhibit at the University of North Florida, 2010, 2011. And when they came as a sister city, they thought it was incredulous that this country has never apologized for slavery.
Oh, no, never. No. Now, Rodney, let me ask you this. Now, over the years, now you've told some fascinating stories, and I'm sure we could talk for hours and hear a lot more of them. But let me ask you, over the years, you've likely encountered so many different challenges, and we know that, and you've written about many of them and talk about them and share the stories with people far and wide. But what kind of advice would you give to some of the young people who are struggling or facing the same things, and they're wanting to be more active in their community and wanting to be engaged in activism, but sometimes they may be feeling just discouraged by the obstacles that they're facing. They just get discouraged with it. It seems like every time you turn on the news, there's something that just makes everybody shake their head or face plant, and kids, the young ones coming up today are just they're giving up.
Well, first of all, they have to internalize that race is a problem and racism is a problem. And because there are no visible vestiges of racism, there are no colored and white water fountains and waiting rooms and lunch counters. They have to understand that it is still subtle and it might be below surface, but it is still there. And even though you don't see the aggregate number of marches and direct demonstrations, you still have to understand that the fight is still there. So what do you do? Well, one of the first things you can do is join some of these organizations that are committed to dealing with fighting racism. I've got a friend that I talk about in one of my books who stopped eating table grapes because of Cesar Chavez, and she stopped drinking Coca-Cola products because of the apartheid in South Africa. Sometimes you don't have to do the big things. Sometimes you do the small things. Sometimes in conversations when the family gets together, you have to tell grandpa and uncle that you're not going to be around him if he's got to tell jokes and say nigger, or if he's talking about things on television, it's got to be nigger. We all know that these conversations exist, and they don't exist because people are in a good frame of mind. Some of the things that we see on television, that's the only thing that's missing, that the press and witnesses to some of this information don't say that. Sometimes you have to say that you need to stop saying that. Now, if you don't want to say that, then continue to stand on the sidelines doing nothing and let other folk who will say that say something. But when you're dealing with racism, a lot of people think that, well, they're dealing with black folk and they're dealing with Hispanic folk and other brown folk. It's not bothering me. Yet, a person who is anti-black is many instances anti-female, many instances anti-Hispanic, anti-homosexual, anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ+. A line is not drawn that says you're anti-black and that's it. So a lot of times when many whites think that none of the options by a Supreme Court and the justices appointed by a racist president will impact them, then they begin to see, well, some of the same things they're doing, then they're also anti-abortion. So that impacts you because you elected a president thinking that he was going to do one thing and he put people on the Supreme Court that did many things. So you do the small things. Doing nothing is not an option. And many times doing those small things are just left up to you in terms of how you deal with it. Sometimes, other than joining an organization, there are not convenient marches to be a part of, or sit-in demonstrations, or kneel-in, or wade-ins, or all of the other things that you can demonstrably show your opposition to some things. but just come up with something.
Mm-hmm.
Because, again, doing nothing is not an option. And if white folk understand that in this petri dish where we all are, that we are interconnected, whether we want to be or not, and that when my children are mentally crippled, your children are mentally crippled also. So when we do things for the betterment of all of our children, then they all grow as a result, not thinking that,
Yep.
well, it's something that impacts the blacks and the browns and not the white children, our cherished children. So we just have to understand, and I'm not so much to say that love is the answer. Love is one of the answers. Commitment is another
Sure.
answer. Those persons who say we're going to do something and let the chips fall where they may, bravery and courageousness is another answer. But whatever you do, do something within your sphere. Don't push the envelope if you're not comfortable with pushing the envelope. But don't go to bed at night basically saying, I did nothing because I didn't feel like doing anything, if you're black or white.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Reese?
This is so good. And we won't have these kind of conversations across the table. We try to, and they fail miserably, as we've seen over the history of our country. Let me ask you a question, if you don't mind, Mr. Hurst.
Yes, sir.
In our community, we've seen the attitude or the perspective. Well, ooh, now I have a platform. I'm gonna push being black in white people's face, or I'm gonna jump on this. I'm gonna make this, I'm gonna make this a big thing. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that in our community?
Well, first of all, the black community is not monolithic. So just like black folk don't support everything that goes along with the civil rights movement, we didn't get all the blacks. The civil rights movement was not a cast of thousands. It was a few that grew. Am I frozen?
No, you're good. You're
Okay.
moving.
Civil rights movement was not a cast of thousands. It was a cast of the few, and then later folk joined them, joined the few. Many times there are those who will take advantage of a situation because they can, and their sincerity is lacking, and there's very little that you can do about someone who will exploit a circumstance relative to, in effect, lying about something as opposed to telling the truth. Everything, and I say this when I speak, everything is not a teachable moment. Sometimes you have to understand and be discerning enough to ignore some people and leave them where you find them. I do that both with black folk and white folk. I don't try to convince folk that they should stop being a MAGA or that they should not support Donald Trump. If that's something that they want to do, there's a reason why they're doing it, and it's not my responsibility to try to change their mind. You have some black folk that Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III called bent back Negroes, that they're always walking around with their back bent, trying to show how good they are for white folk to white folk. And he basically said, and by the way, Dr. Haynes has replaced Jesse Jackson as the new director of Rainbow Push. He said, if your back is not bent, nobody can ride you. If you stand up straight like a man or a woman and speak the truth, then no one is going to jump on your back because they're going to slide off. And that's what we have to deal with. There are blacks, and we have seen them with some of the black Republicans, my editorial comments, some of the people who are supporting Donald Trump. I wouldn't go across the street to talk to them about anything, because the reason why you have decided that you're going to support a racist means that you thought about it. And whatever you thought, the good for you outweighed the bad for you. So as far as you're concerned, it was beneficial to you to do that. Now, those persons who will exploit, some of these same persons will exploit that, because then they show white folk what they are willing to do to show them that they're a good nigger. The bottom line is you have to understand, or we have to understand, that in spite of them, we have to make sure the white folk understand they don't speak for you. And not and white folk like to go to just a few blacks and talk with them. In the past, they would always go to the ministers, black ministers, and say, hey, you all see black folk every Sunday. You are the leaders as we determine you are, and we want you to do this, 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 and this. And that has not been the case. So what happens is when those blacks try to exploit the situation, we have to learn how to start calling them out, because we don't do that. In many communities, we like to say, well, let's not create any problems. Let's let bygones be bygones. We've just been too Christianly in dealing with a lot of folk when they have been detrimental to us.
Can I confess, and I have to, in this space, I have to, because I was that black person. I was that black guy going to a left False Temple Church of God in Christ, a little small black church on 24th and Moncrief, where I was raised, and I went to a multicultural church with white pastors, and I felt like I belonged. I didn't go to Ranger Rebault, or I went to Douglas Anderson. So somebody asked me about myself and why did I date the way I dated, why my preferences were the way they were. And I said, I ran to what I thought was better until I took time to know better. Mm-hmm. They did not have my best interest at heart. They used me for what they could get out of me. I was that safe nigger. Can I say that? I was a safe one. Mm-hmm. You could talk, well, you speak articulately, and you studied opera in college, and you're the safe guy. We can talk to you, and you're not angry, and that. But the more I leaned into that, I was like, you know what? Y'all finna be mad at me for a long time. Because that's where I am now. That's just that. Ooh.
By the way, I went to school with Bishop Fall's son.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. He and I went to elementary school together. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's we all go through a process where we evolve.
Yes, sir.
And I always tell folk that you're never too old to learn and you're never too young to teach. And some of the things that I dealt with folk who, in conversation and others, they would get angry. And I said, why are you that angry, graduate students? Because I've never heard this before. No one has ever told me this before. Okay, now that you know it, what are you going to do about it?
Right.
So the whole thing is that I call it dual consciousness.
Okay.
Because many of us have to understand our cultural relevance as a black person, but we also have to try and exist in a society that is white. And unless you know how to get along with white folk, then you don't have a success ratio as a black person. And many times it's because of our perceptions as to what we think we need to be successful in dealing with white folk. Because many times they might say that they like us, and not talking about your situation, but I've seen situations where people will say, did you hear what he said? And my response to them is, why are you telling me that? If you feel that way about him, go tell him. Do you think that telling me I'm going to go and repeat it? No, I'm not going to repeat a damn thing you said. If you talk about him to me, then you talk about me to somebody else.
That's right.
And again, that is part of what we don't understand. But again, we are still babes in the wood, if you will, in understanding each other, understanding our cultures. The biggest problem that we have now, as we had when I was in junior high school 60 plus years ago, was communicating across those racial barriers. I have, on more than one occasion, I have addressed groups with whites and blacks in the audience, and I've had people stand up and say, do you have to use the term racist and racism? It just sounds so harsh. Those words just sound so raw. And my answer is yes, I do. You know. So
well, Rodney, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I want to thank you so much for being with us. I know that you have to go. Any closing thoughts that you have for us? One of the things I wanted to ask you is, what is the legacy that you hope to leave behind?
That I made a difference. There's a gospel song that says, "Let the works I do speak for me," and I want people to think that I've left something here to remind them of me and some of the things I do. I have just tons of sayings, but one of the things I say to groups, don't challenge me until you know me. Don't judge me until you understand me, and don't talk about me until you talk to me. And that, in a nutshell, is how we deal with each other, because I am judged and nobody knows anything about me. And if there's anything that can happen, if I said to white folk, why do you hate me, dislike me, discriminate against me, have those core racial attitudes against me because my skin is black? What have I done to you to make you do that? And the answer is invariably nothing, because you don't know me. And that's what we have to do. My legacy that I hope I leave, if at all, is that I made a difference while I was here.
That is very good. I sure appreciate you. Hold on just a second. Let me get them back in there. There we go.
Okay. Everything just shut down. I'm sitting. Well, okay.
Reese.
Yes, sir.
It was a joy having you here with us today. And I wanted to know, we've got some echo going on with you. That's okay. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Yes. Thank you first and foremost to you, Mr. Hurst, for coming and just being a part of this and having this honest conversation. These kind of conversations need to be had, and they need to be had in these kind of platforms with people who don't look like us. Because, like you said, if you do nothing and you don't say to the people you sit at the table with who look like you, what you're saying is wrong, you're part of the problem. So I'm glad that we were able to do that. I'm so glad that we are seeing, we're just seeing this kind of conversation happen. Thank you so much. Thank you thank you.
Well, that's a wrap. Another fantastic episode of the podcast. You can find us on all the social media platforms, wherever you surf, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter X, Threads, wherever. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. And on our YouTube channel, don't forget to like, share, comment, and smash that subscribe button. If you're streaming audio for the podcast, you can find us wherever you get your favorite podcast programs. In the meantime, I like to tell everybody, take care of yourselves and each other. Until next time, peace.